The desert wind carried the scent of dust and old iron when Clara Wynne stepped off the westbound stage at dusk. Behind her, the wheels of the coach clicked against the rails like a fading heartbeat. Ahead, the world stretched wide and uninviting, miles of pale scrub and copper sky, a land that seemed to ask who she thought she was to come here. She paused, adjusting her hat and brushing soot from her skirt. The paper in her coat pocket was already creased and soft from her fingers. It was a letter, short, practical, signed by a man named Calder Stone. He had written, "A woman of steady character could make a home here. No riches, but an honest roof." Clara had read those words 100 times. There had been no talk of romance, no poetry, just the promise of steadiness, something she hadn't known in years. But as she scanned the empty platform, her pulse stumbled. There was no man in a coat and tie waiting, no polite smile or carriage. Instead, a tall figure sat astride a bay horse near the hitching post, still as shadow. His hair was long and bound with a strip of leather, his skin tanned deep by the sun. When he dismounted and walked forward, the murmurs around the depot quieted. "Miss Wynne?" he asked. His voice was low, carrying an accent she couldn't place. She nodded. "You must be Mr. Stone." He inclined his head. "That's the name I signed. But my people call me Cale." The name hung between them like smoke. It didn't match the careful penmanship of the letter, nor the picture she'd painted in her mind of a farmer seeking a companion. And behind her, she could feel the stares of strangers thick as thorns, curious, judgmental, unkind. Clara's throat went dry. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. Cale's gaze didn't waver. "Most things out here aren't." Without another word, he took her trunk and secured it behind his saddle. "It's a long ride," he said. "We should go before the light dies." Clara hesitated only a moment before climbing up behind him. The horse shifted under their combined weight, and the sound of the departing stage faded into the open plain. As they rode, the land unfolded, a hard country painted in rust and gold, where the river ran like a silver vein through the dust. The air smelled of mesquite and rain that never came. Kyle spoke little, though once he pointed toward the dark smudge of mountains to the south. "That's where I was born," he said. "My mother's people lived in those canyons. You left them?" Clara asked. "They left me," he replied simply, and said no more. The sun sank behind them, and by the time they reached a low cabin near the river, the first stars had begun to blink awake. Kyle swung down and offered his hand. His palm was calloused, his grip careful. "It's not much," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "But it's real." Clara looked at the small dwelling, wood patched with stone, a faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney, and for the first time in months, something inside her unclenched. She stepped down, feeling the earth firm beneath her boots. "Real," she repeated quietly. "That's all I ever wanted." But as she followed him toward the door, the last light caught the edge of the river, and she couldn't shake the feeling that both of them were standing at the edge of something neither yet understood. That night, as the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, Clara realized that the stranger she'd trusted with her future carried secrets older and heavier than her own, and before dawn, she would see the first shadow of what he'd left behind. Clara barely slept that first night. The walls of Kyle's cabin were thin, breathing with the wind. Somewhere outside, the river murmured against its stones, steady and soft like a voice she almost recognized. Kyle had shown her to a small room with a quilted bed and a jug of water by the window. "It's yours," he'd said simply, and left her alone. No assumptions, no questions, just quiet. When the light came, pale and gold, through the chinks in the wall, Clara rose and washed her face in the bowl. Her reflection in the rippling water looked like a stranger, older than she remembered, but steadier too. The eastern sun touched the cottonwoods outside, turning their leaves into coins of fire. She stepped out to find Cale already splitting wood near the shed. He glanced up once, then back to his work. "You're up early," he said. "Old habits," Clara replied. "Farm mornings start before the roosters," he nodded. "There are no roosters here." "Just the wind," she smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I'll listen to that." He handed her a cup of coffee, black, strong, unsweetened. "The kind that bit back," She took a cautious sip and nearly coughed, but said nothing. It felt rude to complain when he'd offered it wordlessly, as though such gestures carried more weight than they looked. After a while, Clara asked, "Is it only you who lives here?" Cale set the axe down. "Only me," he said. "Sometimes a child from the village comes by. Helps with the horses, steals my apples. That's all." "What village?" He pointed downriver. "Half a mile that way. Small place. Some of my mother's kin still live there. Some pretend they don't." Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. In Ohio, talk of mixed blood had always come with whispers behind doors, as though humanity could be divided like fence lines. But Cale's voice carried no shame, only weariness, like someone who'd stopped explaining himself long ago. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Clara found herself studying the land, the stubborn green by the river, the red dust, the slow grace of the horizon. This was a place that demanded effort, not apology. By midday, she asked if she might tidy the kitchen. Kyle shrugged. "Do what feels right." She spent hours sweeping, sorting, washing the few dishes he owned. Each task steadied her. In the corner of the room, she found a shelf with small carvings, animals shaped from driftwood, smooth and careful. "Did you make these?" she asked when he returned from the corral. He glanced at them briefly. "When the nights were long," he said. "They're beautiful." He gave no answer, but a faint smile tugged at his mouth, the kind that almost didn't want to exist. Later that afternoon, Clara wandered outside to the garden plot beside the house. It was overrun with weeds and half-dead stalks. She knelt, brushed away the dry soil, and began to pull the roots one by one. She wasn't asked to. It simply felt like something that needed doing. She was halfway through when a sudden voice startled her. "You'll need to turn it before you plant," a girl said from the fence. Clara looked up. A small, bright-eyed child perched on the rail, dark braids swinging, grin wide and sure. "And how would you know that?" Clara asked. "Because I told Cale that last year," the girl said proudly. "He never listens." Clara laughed softly despite herself. "Then perhaps I will." The girl hopped down and offered her hand. "I'm Marisol, and if you're staying here, you'll want to learn which weeds bite back." Clara took her hand, dirt and all. "Then teach me." As the two of them began to work, Clara felt something strange settle over her, a small spark of belonging. That evening, as the sun bled red across the river, Clara would learn that Marisol wasn't just a passing visitor, and that the child's past was bound to Cale's in ways that could change everything she thought she knew about him. By the time the sun had melted into the rim of the hills, Clara and Marisol had pulled nearly half the weeds from the garden. Their hands were brown with soil, fingernails lined with dust, but both were smiling. The girl worked fast, her movements sure and practiced. "Kyle lets me plant beans sometimes," Marisol said, tossing a clump of weeds aside. "They never grow right because he forgets to talk to them." Clara laughed softly. "Talk to them?" "Of course," the girl said as though it were obvious. "How else will they know they belong?" That struck Clara harder than she expected. For a moment she just watched Marisol, small and bright against the vast landscape. "You sound like someone who's done a lot of belonging," she said gently. Marisol shrugged. "I belong lots of places for a little while." When they finished, Kyle returned from the ridge, carrying a bundle of firewood on his shoulder. He paused when he saw the two of them kneeling in the dirt. "Didn't know I hired a whole crew," he said dryly. "Then you've just become a lucky man," Clara replied. Marisol grinned. "She's better at this than you." Kyle raised a brow at the girl. "You planning to stay for supper, or just for the insults?" The child grinned wider. "Depends what's cooking." That night, the three of them shared a simple meal, flatbread, beans, and strips of dried venison Cale had smoked weeks ago. Clara added wild herbs she'd found near the river. The air inside the cabin filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When the plates were cleared, Marisol curled up on a blanket by the hearth. Kyle watched her with a softness Clara hadn't yet seen in him. "She lives with her aunt upriver," he explained quietly. "Comes by when the food runs short." "Her parents are gone. How old?" 10, maybe 11. Clara folded her hands in her lap. She's a good child, Kyle nodded once. Too clever for this place. Clara studied him in the firelight. His face was worn but calm, a man used to solitude and suspicion. There was strength in him, yes, but also something else. A quiet ache that seemed older than either of them. After a while, she spoke softly. You could have sent me away when you saw me step off that stage. He didn't look at her. Did you want me to? No, she admitted. But I thought you might. Kyle stirred the fire with a poker. You came here honest. That's more than most. They sat in silence after that, listening to the river. Marisol's breathing grew slow and steady. Clara's eyes drifted to the window, where the moon cast its silver reflection across the water. This land feels lonely, she said at last. Kyle's voice was low. Lonely's not the same as empty. Sometimes, it's the only thing that listens. When she went to her room later, Clara found a folded blanket left on her bed. A small gesture, but it made her throat tighten. She sat for a long time, tracing the worn stitching, thinking of the miles that had carried her here. In the dark, the fire outside hissed and shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, coyotes called across the plain. It was a strange, wild lullaby, and for the first time in years, she slept without dreaming of fire or loss. But the morning would bring a different kind of reckoning, a storm that didn't care about new beginnings or fragile peace. Before the next sunrise, the sky would turn the color of copper, and the wind would roar through the valley. In that storm, Clara would see what kind of man Cale truly was, and what it meant to stay when the land itself tried to drive you away. The wind came first, a low, restless growl that moved through the cottonwoods like a warning. Clara stood on the porch, apron tied, watching the clouds gather from the north, strange green-gray bruises spreading across the sky. Cale was out by the corral, mending a fence post when the first gust struck. Dust rose in spirals around him, stinging her eyes even from a distance. "Kyle!" she shouted, but the wind carried her voice away. Then came the smell, wet iron and rain, sharp as memory. Clara turned, seeing the storm roll toward them, heavy with sand and thunder. In the east, storms meant shelter. Here it meant endurance. Kyle ran for the horses, his voice cutting through the wind. "Get inside!" But she didn't. Instead, she grabbed the oilskin tarp hanging by the door and ran toward the lean-to, where sacks of feed lay open to the rain. The tarp fought her like a living thing, snapping and twisting. "Hold still," she muttered, wrestling it down over the feed. "Clara!" Cale's shout came too late. A branch split from a nearby cottonwood, striking the ground with a crack that echoed through her bones. "Go!" he yelled, sprinting toward her, his coat whipping behind him. But before he reached her, a section of the shed roof gave way, and a beam crashed down, striking his shoulder. Clara's world narrowed to the sound of rain and pain. She was beside him in seconds, pulling the beam off with all the strength she had. He gritted his teeth, face pale. Blood seeped through his shirt, dark and steady. "It's nothing," he growled. "It's not nothing," she snapped. "You're hurt." He tried to stand. "I've had worse." "Well, not with me around," she said fiercely. "Now sit before you fall." The storm raged around them, rain turning the earth to mud. Clara tore a strip from her apron, pressing it against the wound. Her hands shook, but her voice stayed steady. "You're lucky it didn't break bone." Kyle met her eyes, rain streaming down his face. "You should have gone inside." "So should you." For a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. Defiance, concern, maybe something deeper. A smaller voice broke through the chaos. "Cale, Clara!" Marisol came running from the river path barefoot, hair plastered to her head. "The fence is coming loose." "Stay back!" Cale barked, but the girl darted forward anyway, fearless. They worked together, Cale, despite his injury, holding the horses steady while Clara and Marisol tied what they could, anchoring tarps and boards against the wind. It felt endless, like fighting the sky itself. When the storm finally broke and the thunder rolled away into silence, the three of them stood drenched, mud up to their knees, breathless. Kyle sank onto the porch steps, exhausted. Clara knelt beside him, her hands still trembling. "Let me see." He let her peel away the soaked cloth. The wound was shallow but angry. She cleaned it as best she could, her movements careful. "You could have been killed," she said quietly. Cale's eyes flicked toward her. "So could you." "Maybe," she said. "But I'd rather die fighting for something than hiding from it." He stared at her a long time, then said, "That fire in you, it's the kind that doesn't burn out easy." She pressed her lips together, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. When she finally sat back, exhausted, she noticed the way Cale's hand lingered near hers on the step. Not touching, but close enough to feel. The storm had left ruin in its wake, broken branches, scattered debris, the scent of wet earth. But beneath it all, something else remained. Trust, maybe, or the fragile beginning of it. That night, as Cale slept with his arm bound in linen, Clara would learn what scars he'd carried long before the storm, and how the past he never spoke of was about to rise again, carried on the next stranger who came riding down the river road. Cale's wound healed slow. For several days he worked with one arm bound in a sling, while Clara took over his chores, chopping kindling, tending the horses, mending the fences that the storm had torn apart. He hated being still. She could see it in the way he watched her from the porch, jaw tight, fingers restless. But every time she caught his gaze, he looked away, pretending to study the clouds or the horses instead. By the fourth morning, Clara brought him a bowl of stew she'd made from the last of their venison. "You'll mend faster if you eat more than coffee," she said. He smirked faintly. "You think food can heal everything?" "No," she said, setting the bowl beside him. "But it's a good start." For a while they sat in silence, the sound of the river their only witness. Then Kyle spoke, voice low and distant. "When I was a boy, my father worked that same river," he said. "He was white, came west chasing gold that wasn't there. Met my mother instead." Clara stayed quiet, letting him find his own pace. He stayed a few years. Then soldiers came, took what they wanted, land, horses, peace. My father left before the dust settled, said he'd come back. He didn't have to finish the story. The bitterness in his voice did it for him. Clara asked softly, "You stayed with your mother's people after that?" "For a time. But the world doesn't care for halves, Clara. To the soldiers, I was an Indian. To the tribes, I was a ghost of something that didn't belong. I learned quick to keep to myself." She looked at him, really looked. The quiet strength, the guarded eyes, they weren't habits. "They were armor. You've built your peace here," she said. "That's something worth keeping." He nodded once. "Peace doesn't last long in these parts." She didn't understand what he meant until that afternoon, when a rider appeared on the far side of the river, a man on a pale horse, wearing a dust-covered coat and a badge that glinted like false hope. Clara saw him first. "Someone's coming." Kyle rose too quickly, his wounded arm forgotten. The color drained from his face. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his coat. "Who is it?" "Someone I hoped the river had swallowed." The rider crossed at the shallow bend, water splashing high against his boots. When he reached the bank, he tipped his hat. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with a grin. "Didn't think I'd find you living this fine." Kyle's voice was flat. "You found me, Eli. What do you want?" The man's grin didn't fade. "Heard rumors. Half-blood rancher, keeps to himself, knows these hills better than any scout alive. Thought maybe you'd be interested in helping old friends." "I don't have friends," Cale said coldly. Eli dismounted, glancing toward the cabin where Clara stood half-hidden by the doorway. "Guess you've got yourself company now," he said. "Didn't peg you for the domestic type." Cale stepped between them, tension sharp as wire. "Say what you came to say." Eli leaned close. "There's talk of a new post being built north of here. The army needs guides. They're paying good money, Kyle. You could use that." Kyle shook his head. "Not interested." "Didn't think you'd be," Eli said, turning toward his horse. "But the army's not taking no easy these days. You might want to think twice before refusing them again." And with that, the man rode off, leaving dust in his wake and silence heavy behind him. Clara waited until the sound of hooves faded before stepping closer. "He's not just some soldier, is he?" Kyle's eyes were dark, distant. "No," he said quietly. "He's a shadow that doesn't forget." That night, Clara would learn what Eli truly wanted, and how his arrival threatened not just Kyle's fragile peace, but everything they were beginning to build together on the edge of the river. Night came heavy and silent, pressing against the cabin walls. The storm had left the air cool, but Clara couldn't sleep. She sat at the small table, a single lantern burning low, tracing her finger around the rim of her cup. Kyle hadn't spoken since Eli's visit. He'd spent the evening outside, sharpening tools, tending the horses, doing anything that would keep his hands busy and his mind elsewhere. Now he stood by the doorway, the fire behind him throwing sharp lines across his face. Finally, Clara said, "You knew he'd come back someday." Kyle didn't turn. I hoped he wouldn't. "Who is he really?" He hesitated before answering. "We served together once, scouts for the army. Years ago, before I knew better," she frowned. "Scouts? They needed men who knew the land. I knew every ridge, every trail. Thought I could use that knowledge to help keep peace." He gave a bitter laugh. Peace wasn't what they wanted. Clara waited, the lantern light flickering across her hands. "They used me to find villages," he continued, voice tight. "Places where families lived, not soldiers. I didn't know what they'd do after. When I did, it was too late." Clara felt her stomach twist. "You left." "I ran," Cal corrected. "Left the uniform in the dirt and never looked back. Eli didn't forgive me for it." She rose slowly, crossing the room until she stood beside him. "And now he's come to drag you back." Kyle's gaze met hers, steady but haunted. "The army doesn't like deserters. They don't like loose tongues either. If they're building a post nearby, they'll want me quiet, one way or another." Clara's hand brushed the edge of the door frame. "Then we should leave." He shook his head. "There's nowhere far enough. The frontier has long arms." The wind outside shifted, rustling the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance a coyote cried, long, mournful, familiar. "Maybe they'll forget you," she said softly, though she didn't believe it. Cale gave her a tired smile. "Men like Eli don't forget. They circle back until the ground itself gives up the chase." He turned toward the dark window, eyes narrowing. "He'll come again. Maybe not alone." Clara felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "Then we'll be ready." He looked at her surprised. "You'd stay? Even knowing what's coming?" She met his gaze. "I didn't come here to run anymore, Cale. Whatever's chasing you, it'll have to face me too." Something softened in his expression, just for a heartbeat. "You've got more courage than sense." "Then we match," she said. They shared a faint smile, small but real, the kind that meant understanding more than words ever could. Outside, the moon rose pale and sharp, lighting the river like a blade. Marisol stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about beans and rain. For a fleeting moment, everything was still again, but the peace didn't last. Just before dawn, Kyle heard it, the distant clatter of hooves on rock, faint but unmistakable. He stepped to the window, scanning the horizon. Far off, a single lantern flickered in the trees, then vanished. Eli hadn't been bluffing. Kyle exhaled slowly, the weight of old sins pressing against his chest. "It's starting," he whispered. By the next sunset, Eli would return, not as a messenger, but as a warning. And when he did, Clara would discover that the past Cale tried to bury could burn everything they'd built to ash. By midday the next day, the air felt wrong again. Still, heavy, waiting. Even the birds had gone quiet. Kyle spent the morning mending a broken stirrup, but his eyes kept drifting to the hills beyond the river. Clara noticed the way his shoulders stayed tense, his good hand never far from the rifle propped by the door. Marisol was helping Clara hang laundry when she asked, "Why's Kyle looking at the hills like that?" Clara tried to smile. "He's just thinking." Marisol frowned. Grown-ups always say that when they're scared. Clara glanced toward Kyle, then back at the child. Then maybe he's thinking about being brave. Not long after, the sound came, the distant rhythm of hooves, steady and unhurried. Kyle looked up, every muscle alert. He moved toward the porch, rifle in hand. Clara followed him to the door. "It's him, isn't it?" Kyle nodded once. "Eli." The rider appeared from the bend in the river trail, his pale horse shimmering with sweat, dust trailing behind. Eli rode slow, like a man who already owned the moment. He stopped 20 feet from the porch and tipped his hat. "Afternoon," he drawled. "Heard there's good stew in this valley." Cale's voice was low and sharp. "You should have kept riding." "Ah, come on now," Eli said, swinging down from the saddle. "No welcome for an old comrade?" Clara stepped closer, her pulse steady but quick. "You weren't invited." Eli's grin widened. "So the lady speaks. You've picked a fine corner of nowhere, ma'am. Shame it won't stay quiet much longer." Cale's jaw tightened. "Say what you came to say." Eli dusted off his coat and leaned against a fence post. "Orders came through this morning. The army's moving north, building a fort not 5 miles from here. They're going to need guides, food, and land to graze their stock. All this," he waved a hand toward the cabin, the fields, the river, "is sitting right where they want to put it." Clara's stomach turned cold. "You mean to take it?" Eli shrugged. "Not me. But men with authority and guns usually get what they want." Kyle's hand tightened on the rifle. "Tell them to look elsewhere." Eli chuckled, low and amused. "You really think you can stop what's coming? You, a half-breed hermit with a busted arm and a woman who doesn't know when to run?" Clara stepped down from the porch before Cale could stop her. "You've said enough." Eli turned his gaze on her, slow and deliberate. "You've got fire, I'll give you that. But fire burns fastest when it's cornered." Kyle raised the rifle slightly. "Leave, Eli. I won't tell you again." The smirk faded from Eli's face. For a long moment they just stared at each other, 2 ghosts from the same past, standing on opposite sides of what was left of it. Finally, Eli swung back into his saddle. "You'll see me again, Cale. When the soldiers come, I'll be leading them, and when that happens—" He gave Clara a thin, hard smile. "You'll wish you'd gone east when you had the chance." Then he turned and rode off, the echo of his horse fading into the wide silence. Kyle lowered the rifle slowly. Clara could see his hands trembling, not from fear, but from fury. "He means it," she said quietly. Kyle nodded, voice rough. "He always does." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere upriver, not from their hearth, but from something larger, nearer, wrong. By nightfall, that smoke would rise higher, and Clara would realize the soldiers were closer than anyone thought, and that Kyle's past wasn't just returning to him, it was marching straight toward their door. Night had fallen, but sleep refused to come. Clara sat by the hearth, her hands twisting the edge of a worn blanket, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Cale moved silently around the cabin, checking locks, inspecting windows, and keeping an ear on every sound outside. "You think he'll really bring them here?" Clara asked softly. Kyle didn't answer immediately. He set down the lamp and leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the wooden planks. "I don't think," he said finally. "I know." The words hung in the room like smoke. Clara shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She wanted to ask more, to demand a plan, but deep down she already feared the answer. Hours passed. The quiet stretched, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. Then, just before midnight, the faint glow appeared on the horizon, orange, flickering, moving steadily closer. Clara gasped. "Cale!" He moved to the window, pressing his good hand against the frame. The glow wasn't natural. It wasn't the moonlight reflecting on the river or the faint glimmer of a distant town. It was deliberate, alive. Smoke spiraled upward, curling toward the stars. "Soldiers," Cale said, his voice low but firm. "And Eli," Clara felt her heart hammering. "How far are they?" Cale studied the horizon. "Closer than I hoped. Too close for comfort." For a moment they simply watched the flames dance from a distance, casting long, trembling shadows on the land. Then Kyle turned, his eyes meeting Clara's. "We need to move. Tonight." Clara shook her head. "Move? Where?" "This is our home." Cale's expression softened, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "It can't stay ours if they come. We either leave on our own terms, or we wait and fight knowing we're outnumbered." Clara swallowed hard. She knew he was right. But the thought of abandoning the land they'd worked so hard to protect felt like tearing herself in half. "Can we really outrun them?" Cale's jaw tightened. "We have to. I've faced worse in the past. But this time it's not just me. It's us. Together." The wind carried a distant sound, a single metallic clink that didn't belong in the stillness. Cale's hand went to the rifle immediately. Clara followed, picking up a small sharpened hatchet from the table. "They're scouting," Kyle said grimly. "Eli's sending them ahead. We need to be ready for whatever's coming." The night stretched long, and Clara and Kyle moved in silent coordination, checking every corner, barricading doors and windows as best they could. Each sound from the darkness made their hearts skip a beat, each flicker of orange light a reminder that the soldiers were closer than ever. Hours later, Cale finally sat against the wall, rifle across his lap. "Rest if you can," he murmured. "Tomorrow will decide everything." Clara lay beside him, exhausted but restless. She could still see the distant smoke, still feel the tension in the air like a living thing. She knew that by dawn nothing would be the same. And when morning came, the first soldiers would appear on the ridge, and Clara would discover a secret Cale had kept buried, a secret that could either save them or doom them both. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Clara's eyes snapped open to the distant rumble of movement, not the wind, not the river, but boots on hard ground. The soldiers had arrived. Kyle was already awake, crouched by the window with a rifle in hand. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the ridge where the enemy advanced. "They're out in the open," he whispered. "Perfect for a trap, if we can set it right." Clara swung her legs over the side of the bed and moved beside him, the chill of the floor biting through her thin socks. "A trap? Cale, we don't have time." Kyle didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a worn leather satchel tucked beneath the bed. He pulled out a small iron box, the edges scarred with age and use. Clara's heart skipped. She had seen it before but never known its contents. "What's that?" she asked, tension tightening her voice. Kyle's eyes met hers, a flicker of hesitation in the shadows of his face. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." He opened the box carefully. Inside lay a series of small, intricate devices, mechanisms of metal and wire, clearly made for sabotage or defense. "These are old family designs," he explained. "When I was younger, my father taught me how to use them. I hoped I'd never have to." Clara stared, a mix of awe and fear twisting inside her. "You're saying we could actually use these against them?" Kyle nodded. "But it's risky. One mistake and—" His voice trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. The distant clatter of boots grew louder. Clara's stomach knotted. Every second was precious. Cale rose, moving swiftly to set up the first device near the cabin's perimeter, while Clara followed, helping as best she could. Each piece clicked into place with a satisfying precision, yet the weight of what they were doing pressed down on her chest. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. By mid-morning, their preparations were complete. The devices were hidden along the paths they knew the soldiers would take. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that passed in the distance, made their hearts jump. Kyle finally turned to Clara, his expression unreadable. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "Something I never told anyone, even you." He reached into the box and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Clara's hands trembled as he handed it to her. The writing on it was precise, almost ritualistic. She could barely make sense of the symbols, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a map. It was a guide, a plan that could either save them or endanger them further. "They're not just after us for land or revenge," Kyle said, voice low. "Eli wants something else, something tied to this map. If they get it, everything changes. For the region, for everyone we care about." Clara's mind raced. Her fear now mingled with a dangerous curiosity. The dawn light caught the paper, illuminating parts of it that hinted at hidden paths and long-forgotten secrets. She realized that the next few hours would decide not only their lives, but the fate of everything Cale had tried to protect. The first soldiers appeared on the ridge, their armor glinting in the sunlight, the sound of marching filling the air. Clara looked at Kyle, seeing both determination and fear mirrored in his eyes. As the enemy advanced, Clara unfolded the final part of Kale's secret, a revelation that could either turn the tide of battle or destroy them both. And with Eli watching from the shadows, there would be no turning back. The soldiers crested the ridge, their figures sharp against the rising sun. Clara gripped the yellowed map tightly, her fingers trembling as Kyle whispered the final instructions. The devices they had set were armed and ready, silent sentinels in the underbrush. Every nerve in her body screamed that one misstep could mean death. Cale gave her a brief nod. "Stay close, follow the plan exactly." No improvisation. His voice was calm. But Clara could see the strain beneath it. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like an invisible chain. The first wave of soldiers advanced toward the hidden path, oblivious to the traps lying in wait. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she counted down the seconds. The quiet before the storm was deafening. She could feel the tension in Cale's stance, the way his hands hovered over his weapons, ready for any sudden move. Then, the first device activated. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, and then a flash of sparks and smoke as the mechanism detonated, sending a group of soldiers sprawling. Chaos erupted. Clara ducked behind a tree, barely holding her breath as the second device triggered, ensnaring another group in a tangled net of wire and metal. The soldiers screamed, their confusion buying Kyle and Clara precious seconds. But Eli was not so easily stopped. From the tree line he watched, calculating every move, his dark eyes scanning for the flaw in their defense. Clara realized he had anticipated some of the traps. They had slowed him, but not eliminated him. "Kyle, we can't hold them forever," she shouted over the noise, fear threading her words. Kyle's jaw tightened. "Then we finish it. We have one shot." He pulled Clara closer and pointed to a narrow pass revealed on the map. "This is it, the path they don't expect. We lure them here and it ends." With a nod, Clara followed, moving quickly but cautiously. The soldiers, now regrouping, followed the chaos of the first attacks, oblivious to the route Kyle and Clara were taking them on. Step by step they reached the pass and Cale gestured toward the final device, a mechanism more complex and dangerous than the others. Clara hesitated, staring at the device. Are we sure this will work?" Kyle met her gaze, a mixture of determination and exhaustion shining in his eyes. "We don't have a choice. It has to." The device activated, releasing a controlled but explosive surge that blocked the soldiers' path entirely. Rocks tumbled down the mountainside, creating an unmovable barrier. Clara felt her heart racing, every sense alert. And then, in the chaos, Eli stepped into view, his face twisted with fury. "You think you can stop me?" he shouted, his voice echoing across the pass. But Cale's hands didn't waver. He stepped forward, standing between Clara and Eli, the last line of defense. A tense standoff ensued, seconds stretching into eternities. Then, in a final, decisive move, Kyle triggered a sequence that disarmed Eli's forces entirely. The soldiers, trapped and disoriented, had no choice but to retreat. Eli, realizing his plan had failed, vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his anger behind. Clara sank to her knees, relief and exhaustion mingling in a wave of emotion. Kyle knelt beside her, the weight of survival finally sinking in. The sun, now fully risen, bathed the landscape in warm light, turning the once perilous pass into a place of quiet beauty. "Is it over?" Clara whispered. Kyle nodded, a tired smile on his lips. "For now, but we've survived, and that's what matters." As they rose together, the map still clutched in Clara's hand, she realized that the journey had changed them both. They were no longer just survivors. They were guardians of something far greater, their bond forged in the fires of danger and trust. And though the shadow of Eli might linger somewhere beyond the horizon, for the first time in a long while, they could breathe freely, knowing that their courage had shaped the dawn.